I'm Cynthia Francis Gensheimer. I'm here interviewing Joy for part of the Colorado NCJW Oral History Project, and we're doing this in her home in Greenwood Village. Joy, would you begin by telling me your maiden name?
My maiden name is Gilbert. My mother was a life member, and she gifted it to both my sister and myself.
And did you grow up, were you born in Denver? And
I was born in Denver at Rose. I was adopted through the Jewish Family Service of Colorado. My first years were up in Mayfair, around 9th and Kearney, within walking distance of the synagogues there. And then my parents moved to just off of Alameda and Monaco in the early 60s.
Oh, okay. And where were your parents from?
My parents had served in the British Army and were British. My mother was from an area called Bognor Regis in Sussex, which is about 15 miles from Brighton. And my father grew up in the Lower East End of London. And most of his family, though, comes from Manchester in the Midlands.
And how did they wind up coming to the United States?
After World War II, the British, my father was wounded 3 days after D-Day in France. And so he was mustered out prior to VJ Day. My mother was a coder at Bletchley Castle and worked for MI6. When they demobilized, everybody was demobilized at one time. The United States after the war demobilized in stages. So there was massive unemployment in England. A person who basically had two arms but the use of only one could not find employment. My great aunt lived on the west side of town and sponsored them to come here. And that's how they came to the US.
And did they have a difficult transition to life here?
My father would never admit that anything was difficult. He just kind of, so if you lived through D-Day, nothing was a crisis, if you will. My mother had PTSD, or what we would call it today. I can't tell you that. The people who would know also had their traumas from World War II. So I don't know how reliable or how honest or whether or not they saw it as a trouble or tribulation or a difficulty. So I cannot help you.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to elementary school?
I started at Palmer Elementary, which was just west of the old Beth Joseph on 9th and Grape with my cousins. Then we moved to Fallis Elementary, which is now the ecology school, over on Virginia, both of which were heavily Jewish neighborhoods. Mayfair was kind of like where a lot of people, when they first came to Denver, or it was their first homes, then their second home was like Winston Downs, or the area where we were, which was right across the street from Winston Downs. And then the next generation, as you know, moved out to the hills east.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
So it's the general migration pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And did you and your sister then receive a traditional Jewish education, would you say?
What do you define as traditional? Going to a day school?
No, more, did you belong to a congregation?
We belonged to Beth Joseph. My father used to cantor over at the Alliance on the west side and help them out. When BMH merged back into BJ, we made the merger over. Yes, we had Hebrew school Mondays, Wednesdays, and Sundays. And it was an interesting education.
Did you have, you didn't have a bat mitzvah,
No.
I assume, But
No.
were you confirmed? Did they have confirmation?
I was asked to leave BMH and BJ for asking questions that were inappropriate, they felt. My father had a very, very Orthodox upbringing. And we come from a long line of clergy. And his desire was that I have what we would call an egalitarian education at this time. Back in the 60s, it wasn't egalitarian. It was revolutionary or destructive that a girl should want to know certain things. And so when I left, when Rabbi Goldberger and my parents decided it was wiser for me to depart from the BJ Hebrew School, my father undertook my Hebrew education. And so it became very eclectic because it was what he was interested in. So there was Torah, there was a little bit of Talmud, a lot of examination, because our family was tied into Rabbi Hertz and the British Empire's rabbinate. A lot of the materials came from there. And they were probably materials that were given for boys to study as they grew older. But my father felt that I was entitled to know. My sister wasn't interested, but I was. And it began what has come to be a lifetime of learning, various things and various laws and so on.
So was your household growing up, did your parents keep kosher?
Yes,
And did they celebrate holidays?
of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It was I would say we were what would be called a traditional European Jewish house. We were not hyper-Orthodox, but we were not lax. So there was a great deal of elasticity because my father just didn't fit the traditional mode of what fathers ought to be. I was taught there was nothing I couldn't do, and that there was nothing I couldn't be, and there was nothing that I couldn't learn. Now, that was a problem with chemistry and physics and so on when, thank God I had 10 fingers and 10 toes and I could get to 20. But as far as everything else was an open opportunity.
And you had no brothers, right?
No brothers.
What high school did you go to?
George Washington.
And were your friends mostly Jewish there?
Yes, until the riots. George Washington had a very, very difficult period of time. In '69, there were teacher strikes. And most of us were very supportive of the fact that we felt the teachers were being paid very little to put up with people like us. But we were kids who were being pushed to achieve. And at that time, I think a geometry teacher was paid, with a doctorate, was being paid like $24,000. It was obscene. I'm sorry, it was obscene. And so we all were very supportive and walked the line and everything else. The next year after that came the Rachel Knoll et al. V. Denver Board of Education, which was a very good case. And it dealt with the fact that there had been systematic underfunding of certain schools in the Denver public schools. And needless to say, where the money went was where the money was. And the determination was that the school system needed to be desegregated in order to fix this. Our class at George Washington, a portion of the class of '72 was sent to manual. Then a piece of East High School which was the most achieving, and East High School outdid George Washington every year. So it really didn't matter. But the members of the football team, the members of the National Honor Society, the members of a lot of the clubs, and a lot of the intelligentsia lived in this boundary that Judge Winter decided should go to George Washington. It tore at the fabric of East High School. One person in George Washington triggered a riot. And the riot went for 2 weeks. He was an interesting person. He's no longer alive, so let's let him rot where he is. And my friendships changed dramatically. And my philosophy of getting through school changed dramatically. And that was what has triggered pretty much the journey that I'm on. So it's a 50-year trip now. It is not appropriate to make comments about people you don't know and say it to their faces and not expect them to have a reaction. And that basically is what happened. It was a devastating time. We were a school of 3,600 kids. Lowry Air Force Base was still open and the housing was there. You had Hilltop, you had the area adjacent on both sides to George Washington. So Virginia Village, Virginia Vale, the area, the King Soopers at Leetsdale and Monaco did not exist at that time. That was a ranch, that was a farm. The Twilight Golf Course was something that the owners of this farm had carved out for themselves, and they opened it to the public. That was all agriculture and horses. It tore at all kinds of things. I think it made people in the Jewish community have to think about some things that had never, not because of evilness or ignorance or anything else, had never thought about. And it highlighted that not only was there racial tension there, anti-Semitism was a horrible problem at George Washington.
Did you personally experience anti-Semitism?
Oh yeah, and I got the teacher fired.
Please tell us the story.
There was a teacher there who taught high-level English, and he was notoriously anti-Semitic. And he wore it proudly and he wore it openly. And he also had a fetish for high school girls. And he chose one day to call me a pejorative name.
What did he call you?
He called me a kike. And I stood up and I walked out. And at that time, I was acquainted with several people on the Denver School Board. And I went home and I called these people. And I said, this is what's going on, and I'm going to file, and I want this guy fired. Because if he says it to me, and we know he has said it to people previously, he will continue to say it. He kind of went on leave. It was a tense time. It showed power. It showed that you could speak up. He also had a penchant for calling certain members of the class other pejorative terms.
So blacks and Asians, or?
You know, George Washington did not have a lot of Asians at that time. We had some, when I use the term Latino, I'm thinking of my friend Carlos. We had 15, maybe 20 families who were refugees from Cuba who had moved into the area, boat lift families. I remember very few Asian families. If we had them, they were probably because their parents were stationed at Lowry. Denver had neighborhoods. And the second generation of Asians really had not started to move into central Denver and into southeast Denver. They were more in Lakewood, Arvada, and Northwest. Just as you had Italian immigrants who stayed over in the Arvada Northwest quadrant at the time. It's where people settled, and so that's where people's families stayed.
Right. Now, were you involved with Jewish clubs when you were in high school?
I was a member of BBYO, and I suppose you want me to name the chapter, right?
Oh, no.
Oh,
That's
good.
okay.
Actually, we were the chapter that was formed after the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So we kind of had a very interesting, kind of forward-looking group. I understand that after college, it didn't quite make it that far.
And what about sororities? Were there Jewish sororities at your high school?
I want to say I think so, but I tend to remember something, but I can't really tell you what.
I understand that.
It didn't impact
Didn't
my
leave
life
it.
enough.
Right. And what about college? How did you choose where you were going to go and where did you go?
Where I could afford it, to be perfectly blunt. I started at the University of Denver. When the University of Denver decided to triple their admissions costs and their tuition, I moved down to Metro. It was a very good, thriving environment. It was very urban. We were scattered over 35 or 40 buildings. Auraria was kind of a dream in State Senator Joe Shoemaker's mind that you could have a continuum of learning in one location, which was radical at that time.
What did you major in?
Political science, pre-law. I took every constitutional law class, every law class I could get my hands on, so that you could see from the civil side what the Constitution was, and from the application in the criminal law side.
Did that lead to a career in law for you?
No, it led to a career in oil and gas. Where,
Of course.
well, and it was in one of the boom periods as opposed to one of the bust periods. But I was a landman, and I did support personnel and math and took leases and so on. So you kind of masquerade as somebody who, because landmen are not necessarily lawyers and they do not need to be.
Could you define that term for me? It's not what I'm familiar with.
Okay, a landman is a person attached to an oil and gas firm. Back at the dawn of time, they probably were not much different than Barnum and Bailey and their health tonics. But what a landman evolved into after World War II was someone who would go out to a property, research who owned the property, and if they owned the mineral rights, excluding water in the Rocky Mountains. And if they did, attempt to take an oil and gas lease. And what that would do is you would pay them a bonus for the signature, if you will, and then you would pay $1 a year for the acreage. If they drilled on the property, then the landowner got a certain amount of money off the top of the lease and the production. So if it was making $1,000 a day, a farmer would get $125 gross off of that. And then we would act as the liaison between the oil and gas company, the farmer, the purchaser of the product, and so on.
And how did that lead to, was that in any way related to your involvement in NCJW?
I started it. Have you spoken with Doris Lackner?
We interviewed Doris, and I love Doris, so I have
Okay.
had talked to her many
Doris
times.
was the president when I was in high school. And Doris's daughter, Nancy, and myself, and Miralee Wallach, God rest her soul's kids, we tried to make a junior NCJW chapter. And the hope of it was that we would go into and continue to do volunteer philanthropic activities. I think in some cases we all have. In some cases, we took our skills that we learned and put it into business or put it into something else. NCJW and the opportunities they gave us didn't necessarily overtly impact what we did, but through that period and through the 80s, because to a great extent NCJW and the Denver section, and remember, when my mother bought me my life membership when I turned 18, there were close to, I think, 2,500 members. It was a very large and very vibrant group of women. As we aged, we lost the younger people because we went to work. When I was on the road, it was kind of hard to go to NCJW because there wasn't Zoom.
Of course.
And I can remember in being rural parts of Ohio or Kentucky, and there's no way I could get to a meeting.
Right. Could we return just to
Yeah.
for a moment to your mother's involvement? I should have asked you about that
No problem.
at the outset. What was her role within NCJW?
My mother was a member. She helped out with various small projects, but from the mature daughter looking back on growing up, there was a lot that my mother could not do. My mother was in and out of institutions. It was believed after World War II that women could not have any kind of effects of the war. And that was an American precept because most American women were kind of protected on the island, if you will, of the United States. My mother went through nightly bombings and all kinds of things, and it left her exceedingly traumatized. So she would help where she could, but her capacities were very limited. But her encouragement to be part of it was based on the fact that Jewish women needed to have a place where they could comfortably speak, comfortably talk, comfortably participate in society as equals, and not get put down for doing it. When she was part of Bletchley, it was almost unheard of that women would participate in war, period. This was Churchill's idea, that women had a greater skill base for coding and decoding and so on. That was a very radical concept. And my mother never let go of that radical concept when they moved here. And so she, much like my father, believed there was nothing that a girl or a woman could not achieve. Council, in that period of time, granted an enormous amount of bandwidth to the ability of women to do things. And I think it's vastly underestimated what the power of these women were and the power of behind the scenes. The lessons they imparted that you didn't see being imparted, and I am sure that if you talk to Doris or to Marlena, or if, God bless her, Maxine were still here, they would be stunned to hear somebody say they imparted these lessons, because they were just living their lives and probably never realized what they were teaching. And that is something that council here was dramatically important. The fabric of Denver is woven with the threads of National Council. And they aren't necessarily seen because nobody thought about it. It was considered the natural course of events that Jewish women would participate in X.
So tell me what really brought you in as an adult to be interested in the work that the NCJW was doing.
It was a reintroduction, if you will. When I had the opportunity to stop traveling, I had the opportunity to tell my boss, I have to take off at 11:30. I'll see you at 1 and come back, because they knew I would stay till 6:30 to make it up. There were positions and activities that council was involved in, particularly down at the state legislature, where the impact of thoughtful, well-read, articulate, educated women could have a place in the volunteer lobbying society down there. It was a different kind of mentality to today, in that people were persuadable based on giving a fact. The legislature worked on inches, not feet or miles. There's a lot of things that started, and I will bring something up interestingly. We fought on behalf of damages if somebody was wronged. What was a fair damage number in 1980 something? Our interest in education and opportunity, and the fact that education brings people up, were things as a lifetime learner, you cannot convince me that education is not the door through which everybody should go. It may not be the direction you actually think you're going to go in. It usually isn't. But it's usually where you're meant to be. To study and to learn and to work with other people and teach is very important.
So how did this translate into what you were doing in the legislature? Did you attend sessions of the legislature?
No, I picked up the phone and called friends and said, hello, I understand such and such is going to be covered. Well, yeah, that bill's coming up next week. Why? Well, I think you need to really delve into it and read it and look at it from the view of 5 years down the pike. Is this something you want? Or are you going to revisit it?
So these were legislators you were contacting?
Of course.
And were they Republicans and Democrats, or did you have...
Yes. You didn't have to worry about whether or not the other side would talk to you. Because at that particular time, the difference between a Republican and a Democrat is the space between my fingers. That's a bridge that is so easy to span. And we had wonderful people who lobbied and spoke and were articulate and took care. when we adopted our daughter, those skills and those people enabled me to attend hearings speaking about open adoptions in Colorado, and why that's an important issue, and why history is important.
So the issues that you were lobbying for as an individual NCJW member, you weren't representing the organization per se.
No.
But
No, but you'd get a letter saying, hey, everybody, these are the issues that are going to be coming up this session. Speak to your legislators. Speak to the people you know. We had, if I remember correctly, there was a legislative committee of like 6 women who did nothing but bury themselves in this. And they kept us aware of stuff that was going on, because if you were working full-time, your ability to do things is severely limited. If you're out of town, again, even more limited. My daughter wasn't adopted until I was well into a number I won't talk about. When I spoke on behalf of adoption and adoption agencies and what children needed to know, if I hadn't known how to pick up my phone and call someone and say, hey, this is it, and to have their home number, very important to do. And to this day, that's what matters. And that's still today what we do.
So the issues that you were involved with were child-oriented for the most part,
Yes.
education, adoption.
Yes.
Did you get into foster parenting at all, or?
If you are adopting a child, you have to go through the foster parent program. And you are a foster parent in Colorado for 6 months. And that's what that adoption hearing is about, is the termination of the foster. In many other states where they use the Universal Adoption Act, that is not true. I was lobbying for us to adopt the Universal Adoption Act, which sets out a national awareness of what should and shouldn't happen, so that everybody's on the same page. Because otherwise you can get caught into some pretty ugly things.
And did you get involved in the juvenile justice system at all?
No. And the reason I didn't was at the time I would have been involved, there was a lot of problems down, particularly at Gilliam, which is the Denver Juvie Hall. And they had some major problems with some of the administrators and juvie judges. And that was a quagmire that I couldn't do, no.
And so within NCJW, I assume you
Yes.
attended meetings and you forged friendships with people through
Yes.
NCJW. Did you feel any tension between Republicans and Democrats, or a difference in political perspective at that time?
No, there wasn't. And part of the bond that held us all together, and I know this is a divisive statement here, was Roe v. Wade. Whether you were a supporter or you weren't a supporter, in Colorado, we were one of the very first states to allow abortion under certain circumstances, under certain times, and some of us wanted more, some of us wanted less. This is going to sound strange. In 1973, reproductive rights were at best described as primitive. And so the desire to save lives because of the primitiveness was a great deal of what held us all together. All of us knew somebody or had a story that would shake you to the core if it was shared with you.
I think you're talking now about the mothers' lives, right?
Mothers and children. There wasn't a conversation about either. The belief was that at the very beginning, it was a woman's choice. And I'm using archaic vocabulary because that's the vocabulary of the time. I don't know that there was a conversation about mother per se. The woman should have certain rights to control parts of her body. And that was the discussion in 73 and 74 and 75.
So within NCJW, there was a unanimity of
Yes.
opinion on that
Because
particular
all of us knew somebody that had a horrid experience.
a botched abortion that was
And died, or was mangled and mutilated, or something that was just beyond the pale. And therefore, that should not take place. And that was, and I think part of the Colorado response was that since 67, we had laws in place. So we were kind of like, doesn't affect us. We're going to just keep on going our way.
and then as time progressed, were there shifts within NCJW, political shifts? Did you observe any of that?
Very much so. And they tended to be more lurches than movements. I was in and out at that time. But by then, the women who had brought me in and mentored me were probably in their 70s and started to go into, and when they had begun, they were in their 30s. And this was a very vibrant personal issue. I didn't have a Hobson's choice, but I could understand where friends of mine did, because there were no options. You had A or you had B. And things changed and lurched, if you will, as more availability of options came forward.
Are you still talking about abortion?
Abortion, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But I'm speaking more broadly at this point in terms of NCJW.
But it was all centered there.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Abortion was a very major issue. There was still work in education. There was still lobbying on various things. NCJW was very modern, orthodox, conservative, and reform in its makeup. The West Side woman or the Chabad person did not feel comfortable there. Part of it could have been educationally, or could have been being brought up to not be as questioning. In the 80s, there started to be the downturn of membership. More women working, less time for outside activity. More options if you wanted to do something. And not only was the 80s the period of the gigantic shoulders and the horribly big hair, it was also I have to join the CPA Society, I have to join the Kiwanis, I have to join this group or that group in order to advance my career. And so National Council of Jewish Women, as many other organizations across the country, suffered almost an implosion. It happened very, very quickly. And I think Council and various other organizations, from Sisterhoods to the League of Women Voters to Hadassah, have seen the same situation. I don't think it was a Republican v. Democrat thing. I don't think it was a choice versus no choice versus partial choice. I don't think any of that was really a party to it. The
And
80s were just a flux. The 90s, we saw, in the 90s, council had a little problem. And the problem was resolved. And I am very proud to say I was part of the resolution on the problem. There was an embezzlement. There was a young woman who was the treasurer, and over several years siphoned off monies.
how much did it amount to all told?
I want to say well over $100,000.
Oh my word.
Oh, yeah. I was working as an intern at the Attorney General's office in the Department of State Services. And in state services were the attorneys who defended the governor, and the statewide offices would defend the legislature. But we had a section that did student loans and student fraud. And that was at the same time as a vocational school up at the Jeffco Airport was busted for false loans and fake loans and things. And I volunteered to look at the books when things didn't make sense. And if it takes a relatively unexperienced person about 15 minutes, we brought in volunteer accountants and so on and so forth. We did file for insurance money. The Arapahoe County District Attorney, the 18th JD, got involved.
Now this is with the school you're talking about?
No, this is with council.
So were you the president at this point?
No, I was serving on the board. I had gotten married. I had just left my internship and gone back onto the board of council. And Sue Hoffman, God rest her soul, Marlena Siegel, Maxine. We were all looking at the numbers one day, and I said, how come we're so short of money if we're doing all this stuff? And all of a sudden, it was like a wet rag was thrown in the room. And we started delving in, and we found problems. We were very lucky in that we had people who helped us. And that we filed an insurance claim. It was turned over to the 18th Judicial District. I want to say, let me think. I think it was Bob Gallagher or Jim Peters was the DA at the time. And we were victims. Council was able to reestablish her financial health at that time.
She was a woman who was obviously one of your members, or was it some
long-term life member?
Oh my.
It was a very odd situation.
But you were able to get back on a good financial footing after that?
Because we called in our insurance and then various things, and people were very, very kind.
And instituted new policies, I would assume,
yes.
going forward?
Yes.
Did you lose members over that?
I don't think we did. It was a public secret as opposed to a horrible issue. We kept it out of the papers. We kept it out of the press. And that probably helped. By that time, the membership had pretty much, this is going to sound cold, we had had a wave of deaths, which is just a generational situation. We were down to about 250, 300 members by then. We were not successfully recruiting younger members. We were not particularly adversarial in our approach to things. And to some extent, time was changing and events were changing around us. As more states on reproductive rights changed their positions and so on, Colorado's position kind of became yesterday's news. In some cases, it was more small L liberal than other states. In some cases, it was more small c conservative than other states. And we just kind of moved on. I became president at the same time we were going through the adoption process for Maddie. My council,
what year was that?
99.
Okay.
98 and 99. My council sisters, and that's the only way to phrase it. My council sisters surrounded my husband and I and our family in as tight a bond as you could possibly do. The fact that we made it through and the institutionalizing of my mother at the same time couldn't have happened if it weren't for them. We never would have survived the rigorousness of the processes we had to go through.
The emotional difficulty
That
associated.
too. But just the physical. We ended up adopting out of the state of Colorado because as older parents, we were told that we were too poor to adopt a child in Colorado. Okay, that's fine. We'll go elsewhere. A childhood friend of mine found an agency, and that's how we were able to adopt.
And this NCJW cohort supported you, and
she is a member in Philadelphia, actually. Literally, we all grew up together in the neighborhood, and we reached out to who we knew. We were originally supposed to do a Russian adoption, and boy, did that one fall apart. And again, my sisters in CJW didn't ask. They just came.
And so what, as president, you seem to have had your hands full at that time. So
I only remain now, when I became president, I was part of a triumvirate. And I will tell you, a three-party ruling of an organization does not work. Marilyn Kopelman, Karen Sirota, and I agreed that we would do this. It was an unholy mess. And council survived in spite of us, but it was I ended up leaving because what we didn't know, because nobody knows it about babies, is I had a child who wanted to spend between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. up awake and playing. And I did not believe in medicating babies. So I had the choice of being able to be alert and awake during the day or alert and awake at 2:30 in the morning. And I chose 2:30 in the morning. I left council at that point.
did you ever return in any capacity to any?
I chaired, I chaired with Michelle Wright, she and I chaired the candidates forums, several of those. I acted as an advisor. I have never not been available to return the service that, again, Maxine and Doris and Marlena and everybody did, which is to mentor. And I did it for several years. I love the Candidates Forum. I do not love how it's become. And with the shift, here you go, you're asking. And with the shift came different priorities. And National was going through some severe financial traumas, which caused them to have to reboot. They were taken to the cleaners by somebody. Hadassah was taken to the cleaners by the same person.
This is the Madoff scandal.
Yes. In turn, council had to make dramatic changes because all of a sudden, the council of our growing up did not exist anymore. Be it in New York or DC or St. Louis or Houston, as well as Denver. I believe the membership by the early aughts had dropped precipitously by many, many thousands. There was a retrenchment. My differences with National caused me to withdraw and pull back.
These are your philosophical differences with the direction where they were
Yes.
focusing their energies.
Well, and also where they were putting their monies. So it was both fiscal and philosophical. The NCJW I grew up with was highly educational, was highly motivational to give people information so they could make good decisions in their lives. The National bent, and as it took a turn toward a larger L liberalism, became discriminatory in its attempts to become egalitarian. And if you were a middle of the road Republican, you were not welcome. The last meeting I attended, the amount of vitriol and hate that came spewing out of people for no good reason. I don't like that environment. I do not live in that environment.
This was a meeting here.
This was
Denver.
a meeting here. And I decided that there was absolutely no room for counter opinion.
And just to make it clear, you're a middle of the road Republican.
I consider myself to be very middle of the road. Mm-hmm. I also, let me define what used to be a Colorado Republican. Leave me alone. Period. End of the discussion. Leave me alone. Take care of the streets, take care of crime. We need public health because there are always going to be people who need help. And leave me alone. So you can figure out where on the abortion side I sit. As it became more and more and more militantly pro-abortion, a person like me who kind of felt like there's a responsibility, individual responsibility, and science is advancing, and let's have these conversations, were not welcome. And I think as more and more information pops out to people, and your availability of TikTok and YouTube, and the ability to read 15 newspapers a day online, you get an overdose of information. And I think that paralyzes people. And that in turn locks them into a position.
But in terms of education and child welfare,
I've never left that position, that place.
But you said at one point NCJW was very heavily involved with that sort of work.
Yes. Today they sponsor a school and help that way. But I can remember going to the Sheridan schools and teaching children English. I remember working for an oil and gas company and going into 5 Points and not being a mathematician, teaching kids arithmetic, working with them so they could pass their tests, so that they could apply to a private school so that they could go further. The job, the job of counsel was to enable, not to just say. When I was growing up, there was a significant Israel portion to NCJW. And that could have been because there was a lot of crossbreeding with Hadassah and so on. But we had vast learning experiences and conversations. And Native populations of all over the place. At one point, National Council in Colorado took a position on the treatment of indigenous populations of Colorado, particularly the Southern Ute. No. It has, as the organization has gotten smaller and is trying to revitalize itself, to some extent it talks in a bubble now.
And you feel uncomfortable there.
Very.
And unwelcome.
Very unwelcome.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a woman murderer. Please don't imply that. And if you say that, you're going to lose me, and you're going to lose about 50 members that I brought in, because our view does not match yours.
I missed the word. My hearing is not so great.
No worries.
A woman, you're not.
I'm not a woman murderer.
A murderer. Oh,
I'm sorry. I'm not a woman murderer. I'm not a baby murderer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I'm not an ethicist. But my father wanted to murder me, wanted my mother to go to Cuba and have an abortion. My mother refused. In turn, they got married. They gave me up for adoption. So I'm one of the few people who gets to talk because I've been through it. And I have adopted a child, and my sister is adopted. Nobody wants to see the dire extremes of either end. But council has pushed itself so far into a corner politically these days that they can't be part of the conversation. The conversation about women's health, and for that matter, men's health, is going to be decided by a group of people in the middle. And council needs to figure out how to have a seat at the table. They lost a lot of people in the last several years due to their position of embracing people who have stated they want to kill Jews. You can't have it both ways. If someone says they want you dead, they usually want you dead. These are the things that are confronting council now as they go forward. There has to be the conversation about hate. There has to be a conversation about how do I take care of a young man so that their health is good, as well as a young woman who might be afraid to major in something that they haven't ever thought of before, probably because the field doesn't even exist right now. Council, because of her education background for 150 years, and this is where council started, was working with immigrants in the Lower East End of New York to learn English. With waves of immigrants coming in, this is our natural habitat, is working and helping. We worked and helped with Russians in the 70s and 80s. We helped with the Vietnamese boat lift people in the 70s. We have helped with thousands of different kinds of migratory waves throughout this country. Council needs to figure out that to survive, she must embrace her roots. And because there's a lot of groups that jump up and down and yell and scream and post on Facebook.
So if you, in summing up, when you reflect back on NCJW and its glory days in Denver and your involvement with it, what makes you most proud of NCJW?
What we did when we weren't thinking about how it was going to affect us. When we went into the Sheridan schools and worked with the Hmong and Vietnamese kids who didn't speak English. When we went and helped to tutor kids at Children's Hospital or UC Health, back when it was on Colorado Boulevard. When we tutored kids so that they could succeed. When we acknowledged that we could change the world by opening our brains up, emptying them out, putting them out on the table, and could pick and choose and take what they needed and wanted. The fact that we gave our children and other children a window to other opportunities, to be doctors, to be lawyers, to be astronauts, to be engineers, to be anything that you dream about. That's what council in her heyday created and manifested and carried forward. I think council needs to get back to some of her roots. And by doing so, there are a lot of moms who want to reach out and tutor kids. There are a lot of people who want to advocate for kids. I still go to Littleton High School when a non-English speaking kid has a problem with a teacher and advocate for that kid in the system. Why? Because that's what you do.